think it's remarkable that 75% of the proposed increase is just in a few different capability areas between classified activities, missile warning, missile track, moving target indication, and command and control. I think you would expect for a service, if they have this massive increase, for everything to go up, right?
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Hi, everyone. As many of you may be aware, both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives are away on their August break. The House is expected to return just by the end of August, while the Senate is out of session through September 14th. Back in the 1990s, that's normal times, we'd be getting close to finalizing a federal budget, but we are not in normal times. We are in the not so new normal way of doing things, right? So the legislative branch hasn't passed a complete federal budget on time in, I think, almost 3 decades. The government's 2026 financial year, though, it ends on September 30th, and that's when the government runs out of money. The House and the Senate have passed their own reconciliation bills to keep the government open. But when they return, they will need to hammer out a bill that both chambers will pass. And of course, President Donald Trump will have to agree to sign it. And there are other pieces of legislation that guide what that continuing resolution can fund and how much it can fund it by. So remember the 2023 Financial Responsibility Act? So that's the context we're in. And to discuss this, as well as how the U.S. Space Force's budget and the Golden Dome budget for 2027 are changing, we have one of this podcast's budget guys. That's Sam Wilson. Sam is the Director of Strategy and National Security for the Center of Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. And just this week, the Aerospace Corporation released his budget brief titled FY 2027 Defense Space Budget, Dramatic and Targeted Growth. So, Sam, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Laura. Great to be here.
And Sam, before we actually dive into the developing trends that you are seeing in defense space, we've got to be kind and remind everybody about how this second Trump administration has approached appropriations and spending. And I mean the mechanisms by which it's using, because it's bifurcated, right? It's unusual and it also carries risk. So Sam, can you explain the mechanics of this process and how it's played out for the 2026 financial year for the Space Force?
Yes, great question. It is a different how the Space Force and how the Department of Defense, or how the Pentagon's budget is being constructed. And this is the case for fiscal year 2026, as well as the case for fiscal year 2027, which is what our paper that came out this week is about. So there's for fiscal year 2026, you had 2 different legislative processes shaping the Space Force budget. One was the annual appropriations process, in which you had the White House release its budget request, a certain amount for the Space Force, and as well as for the Pentagon, as well as for other agencies. And then there was this second legislative process called reconciliation. And reconciliation was distinct, and it is, again, a completely different process than the appropriations process. But the administration included additional funding, was proposed additional funding through reconciliation for the Pentagon as well as for the Space Force. So for fiscal year 2026, the Space Force budget, the base budget, was $26 billion, but with the reconciliation funds, which is, again, a completely different process, then you had the Space Force budget for fiscal year 2026 was $32 billion. So the Reconciliation Act for fiscal year, that affected the fiscal year 2026 spending, passed on July 4th last year. This year, the White House is also saying, hey, we're going to have this here's our budget request for the appropriations process. We're also going to have an extra 350 million in Pentagon spending and Department of War spending through this other process called reconciliation, which also contains money for the Space Force. So this year, there's again, they're banking on this reconciliation process. However, unlike at this point last year, we have not had a reconciliation act pass that would include this large bulk of defense spending.
So, under this bifurcated situation, why 2027? It's bifurcated. So that means we've got the regular budget bill, which is the one that has to be passed or should be passed. If we were being responsible, we would be passing this prior to September 30th to keep the doors open, right? Okay. So we're not doing that. It's an election year. And then there's all kinds of other political shenanigans going on, and we'll leave that there. But with the reconciliation bill, how much is left to a hoped for reconciliation bill? And hope is not a strategy, but yeah, hope. What do they hope will be in the reconciliation bill?
Right. Great question. So the base budget, the appropriations process, I'm going to refer to that as the base budget request for the Space Force is 59 billion. And then you have 12 billion through reconciliation. And that 12 billion is funding priority programs, high visibility programs for the Space Force, including the Air Moving Target Indication Program, as well as Space Data Network. These have received some press recently. SpaceX has been awarded some contracts for both the space-based AMTI as well as for Space Data Network. These programs, interestingly, were initiated as part of Golden Dome in fiscal year 2026. However, for this year, they're no longer being called Golden Dome. They're under this umbrella called Space Superiority. But like Golden Dome, is also being funded through reconciliation. So it's part of this proposed reconciliation package for defense. So there's a Golden Dome portion, and then as well as the space superiority portion. But again, high visibility programs that I expect would be valuable for the whole joint force.
All right. And also part of this bifurcated situation, I mean, when things go through a regular appropriations process, that means that it goes through committees that say, right, we approve of this idea, these policies, and the numbers that go with these policies. And that'll go through like the Senate Armed Services Committee, right? And then after that, it goes to the Senate Appropriations Committee and their subcommittees, and they start digging into it. So they get some oversight, their hearings and things like that, right? But with reconciliation, I mean, do they get hearings? Because I will note that the Senate, appropriators, they have complained about this bifurcation and how this mechanism, specifically reconciliation, does an end run around the appropriators and has, according to lawmakers, limited their ability to conduct their oversight responsibilities. And is that a fair way to say it? I mean, does reconciliation actually require hearings, or could they require hearings for it?
Well, I mean, you think for the appropriations process, it's a little bit different because this is the White House requesting funding, right?
Right, but through a
Reconciliation,
base budget, right?
right.
Okay.
Reconciliation is a Congress-owned process, right? Like this is actually the authorizing committees are the ones that would put this bill forward. I think again, this gets a little confused because you had both fiscal year 2026 and fiscal year 2027, the White House say, hey, this is actually what we want to get in reconciliation. But again, this is the Armed Services Committees on the defense side will be doing this, which is
Okay.
different from the appropriations process, which goes through the appropriation committees, right? The appropriation committees are going to determine what the budget is. Appropriation committees do not have a role, however, in reconciliation. That is the armed services. That's the authorizing committees. And so
Okay.
for defense, the armed services committees.
So the appropriators would not have oversight, but the authorizers do retain their oversight. Okay, thank you. I really thank you for clearing that up, because no, really, it's like it's confusing and it's annoying
It's
because
confusing to me. It's confusing to everybody. And yeah, I'd say the good news is just from for the sake of this podcast and being able to go through this every year about the budget process is that for next year, it doesn't appear as if they are banking on a large reconciliation package. So obviously things could change, but we can see from the Office of Management budget what they're proposing for next year, and the Space Force would actually retain a lot of the savings, a lot of the increase that it would get for fiscal year 2027 based on that request and proposed reconciliation package, but all in its base budget. So there wouldn't, again, be as much of a reliance if that were to happen on a reconciliation package.
well, let's actually get to what you are seeing and the meat of what is in your report. Because if I understand it correctly, the Space Force and the Department of the Air Force are not only hoping to dramatically increase the Space Force budget, which we talked about in April, you are seeing that the increase is happening at once because the Space Force will be taking over budget lines that were once inside the Golden Dome portfolio, and that the increases are showing up in the base discretionary budget request more so rather than in that risky other way of doing things called reconciliation. So, Sam, explain what it is that you are seeing. Broad strokes, please. And what does this really mean for the Space Force and its future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say one of the stories of this budget, after kind of scratching at it a lot, was this story that last year the budget proposal for the Space Force grew in large part because of Golden Dome. Golden Dome was driving the Space Force budget to increase significantly, right? This year, we see the Space Force budget growing independent of Golden Dome, despite the separation, as you just noted, of Golden Dome and Space Force spending. You're still seeing this big increase for the Space Force. So, I mean, what is the
Well,
effect of
what's
that?
the increase? What is that increase?
The increase for the Space Force budget would be 120% based on this year's request and proposed reconciliation package. And that percentage, I note this in the paper, that is the highest percentage increase for a military service in 75 years, if it were to happen, right? So huge deal. And even with this year's top line Pentagon budget that went way up, right? There's been a lot of reporting about the trillion plus the 350 million in reconciliation for the Department of War. Even with that increase, the Space Force among the military services as a percentage would increase more than 3 times any other, right? So the Marine Corps, Navy, Army, Air Force all would see an increase, but none as a percentage close to what the Space Force, what is being requested for the Space Force. So big deal. And again, a big deal for the Space Force independent of Golden Dome, right? So I just think this is, if you're a follower of the Space Force and want more defense space spending, this is a way to see how the Space Force can have more control over more budget, right? It's not just getting budget tied to Golden Dome, it's getting budget that it gets to control. And again, massive increase.
And it's getting normalized,
Absolutely. I think that's right. I
right?
think
That
it's
this
getting
isn't
normalized.
special because, I mean, remember last year, Todd Harrison, who we love and adore on this podcast, but Todd Harrison did say, that it was a one-time sugar high, right?
It was such a good line. I heard that so many times. I even included it in the paper, right? Like, and I had Todd as a reviewer, and I said, Todd, I hope it's okay that I include this line, and he thought it was funny. But it's absolutely right. This is becoming more normalized, especially as I mentioned earlier, next year, the Office of Management budget seems to be baking in these increases for the Space Force into its base request for next year. We'll see if that happens, but
So then what are the biggest growth changes that you've seen? Choose one and explain what it is and why it's important.
yeah, I will. I'll cheat and I'll say two because I think we can't say we can't ignore the classified increase, right? And there's nothing to say about this except that the classified activities went way up, right? It explains 30% of the growth, the proposed growth from fiscal year 2026 to 2027. I don't know what that's going toward, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is a big share. The other one I'll just note is missile warning, missile tracking. Every year, you and I talk about the budget, sometimes many times in a year, and I love all those conversations. And I think for 5 years, I've been talking about missile warning and tracking because this is a budget area that used to just be less than $3 billion. It was every year less than $3 billion, and that was with big new massive programs like when what was called Next Gen OPIR, Next Generation Overhead Persistent Infrared, was started. And so now you have this Next Gen OPIR program. You have Resilient Missile Warning, Missile Track, which is the idea of using low Earth orbit as well as medium Earth orbit to carry out missile warning, missile tracking. We're also seeing a lot of ground infrastructure being developed for these programs, as well as replacement programs for some of the SIBRs, which is the space-based infrared system, which is the legacy missile warning and missile warning capability. So just huge increases. And we're not just seeing new programs, right? We're seeing those programs get increased more and more. And so, I mean, to me, one of the through lines from that first budget, I'll say fiscal year 2023, when they unveiled those recommendations for low Earth orbit and medium Earth orbit missile warning tracking, to now has just been this expansion of missile warning and missile tracking. And we saw some of this with the announcement of Golden Dome as well. Obviously, missile warning and missile tracking is important for what they're trying to do from a Golden Dome perspective, but also independent of that, right? Like this has been a growth area that we see from the first Trump administration through the Biden administration and now to the second Trump administration. So it's been an area of continuity, I would say also of bipartisan support, right? Like a lot of these capabilities have been increases not just proposed by the White House, multiple White Houses, but then also Congress. Also, Congress has routinely said, yes, we actually think that should be increased and we're going to increase it more. So the missile warning, missile track area has just been a huge growth area for the service in this year's request, but also going back for at least 5 years.
And, since we started talking about FY 2027, which was at the end of April, and you really, took this deep dive into what the numbers are really revealing, was there anything that actually surprised you in there?
Yeah, it surprised me how you have a service that gets 120% proposed increase and then how concentrated that increase was, right? I think it's remarkable that 75% of the proposed increase is just in a few different capability areas between classified activities, missile warning, missile track, moving target indication, and command and control. I think you would expect for a service, if they have this massive increase, for everything to go up, right? For programs in every capability area to get healthy. That's not what we saw here, right? We saw really focused, targeted increases. I think it's really clarifying for what the Pentagon's priorities are for outer space.
And what are those priorities then?
I think those
well, just those capabilities, but maybe there's like a policy line or
Yeah, I mean the command and control one was interesting, right? And I think there's a good question about will the Space Force be this command and control service for the whole joint force, for all the services, right? And so I think that's one that unlike these other three, we hadn't seen huge, massive growth in. before. And so that's one to keep an eye on. But the missile warning, missile track, again, a lot of continuity. Moving target indication, again, I would put that as well in that category of missile warning, missile track of you're really concerned about missile threats. I think a lot of this has been a concern about missile threats and proliferation of missile threats and the complexity of missile threats. So I still think that that's a big point of emphasis. But again, the command and control one I think is an interesting one, an interesting story that it'll be that we'll need to watch for future budgets.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've heard JADC2
Right.
or JADC3 or JADC, whatever number it should be at today. But I also have to say that I think Space Force should be launching a lot, and I was very happy to see that it could, be, at least 31 from which is, double digits as opposed to single digits, right? But I actually think that it should be more than 31 launches a year because it's like telling the Navy, right, that you can only go in the water 31 times, or the Air Force that it can only go into the air 31 times because that's it. But this is the Space Force, so the Space Force needs to be able to go to space, whenever, quite frankly, it wants. And so, yeah, I am looking forward to a more frequent cadence, I guess you could say, in getting that muscle memory of launch. But you have also identified 2026 Space Force funding that overlapped with Golden Dome. So specifically, what's happening with those programs that were funded under Golden Dome for 2026 that are going into the 2027 budget for the Space Force? I mean, why is that significant? And I guess the reason that's kind of an open-ended question, but of course it is significant. But what does it actually say about what's happening with Golden Dome and what's happening with the Space Force?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I will caveat that I can't give you a satisfactory answer for why, right? I don't know. Anything I would say would be conjecture, but I do think it's important. The effect I think we can see, right? So the two capabilities that were initiated, that the budget documents say were initiated as part of Golden Dome, or Space Data Network and Space-Based Air Moving Target Indication. Those are now being moved into Space Data Network. Actually has a mix of funding that's in the base budget as well as some that's in reconciliation. And the Air Moving Target Indication is largely in reconciliation. And those are now being characterized as space superiority programs. But why I think that's significant is that I think again the Space Force is getting more control over the capabilities that it's funding. But also I think it makes sense in that those programs are very vital for not just missile defense purposes, but across the joint force, across for what the Pentagon is trying to do. Space Data Network, this is going to be command and control for so many different capabilities, perhaps. Again, we'll see what this capability ends up looking like, but that wouldn't be surprising to me. So to see that now being regarded as a broader Space Force capability rather than as a specific Golden Dome capability is not entirely surprising. But I think from a Space Force perspective, again, you're getting more control over more budget.
Um, but it does make me wonder about, what is happening with Golden Dome. I mean, is it a project? Is it a program? Is it an office? Is it, what it got me thinking maybe Golden Dome is just a Kickstarter project, right? And that the space piece is, becomes part of the Space Force as well it should be. It makes all the sense in the world. But there's other parts that go into the Golden Dome too that come from other branches of the military. So it has left me also wondering then, right? Who is ultimately in charge of using these space-based tools in concert with what the other services are contributing to what's now called Golden Dome? Because if it loses its funding, it kind of loses its reason to live, I hate to say, right? But yeah, what is ultimately going to happen to this whole construct? because these things are supposed to work in concert with the space layer, which is seemingly going to be owned and maintained by the Space Force. But yeah, where is this going to end up? Where is this going to be orchestrated? Because it is a joint force capability at the end of the day to protect the homeland. So is it going to be a combatant command like Northcom? Is it going to go into NORAD? Is it going to be the Missile Defense Agency? Yeah, like who owns using this?
I applaud you on another really simple question for me, Laura.
Well, I get an expert, we like to call you an expert, so let's get some expert analysis.
No, it's a terrific question. I mean, look, we know that General Gutlein is the direct reporting program manager for Golden Dome, which I have always characterized as, a not a capability, but a set of capabilities or capability of capabilities, right? I think it's the on the operational side. I really don't have an answer for you. We'll see what that ends up looking like, but I think it's important to note, right? There is going to be a space-based piece of Golden Dome that is being funded under Golden Dome. I just don't have a a lot of clarity on what it actually is spending. So this year's request or this year's proposed reconciliation package includes $17 billion for Golden Dome, and $4.5 billion of that is for space programs. Now I don't know even who that's going to. However, the budget documents do reference space-based interceptors. The mandatory budget report on the reconciliation package says that the Golden Dome funding, among other things, will support space-based interceptors. So I would expect space-based interceptors to be a piece of that. But I don't know. Again, I think there's a lot of moving parts. I think General Gutlein has a Herculean task pulling all this together. But again, I think there's just a lot of unknowns there.
Oh, I think Gutlein is herding cats. And I have, all the empathy in the world, but you just touched on something that I wanted to ask you about. Because, yeah, who's in charge of developing and fielding space-based interceptors? Right? Because as you just said, it's in the Golden Dome budget. But I am a little confused, and maybe I read your report incorrectly, but it seems that there are budget lines for space-based interceptors in both the Golden Dome reconciliation request for 2027 and the Space Force budget. Are they doing the same thing? Is this a duplication of effort?
This is such a nerdy question. I love it so much because in the research, development, testing, and evaluation Space Force justification book, which the number of people who are going to actually read this outside of Laura and me, it's like 900 pages.
Well, we do the work for the audience.
It's very
okay.
dense. So there is a project that is a project line that is space-based interceptors. However, the details in the base budget say that this is actually the incorrect title, that this is money going to space data networks, not to space-based interceptors. However, that then description references the fact that space data network will be a command and control capability for space-based interceptors, which it says for the U.S. Space Force Space-Based Interceptors program, right? But there's no Space-Based Interceptors program in the base budget for the Space Force. So I think that what that means is that in that Golden Dome funding, the Space Force would be developing the Space-Based Interceptors program, but that's going to be considered and characterized and budgeted under Golden Dome.
All right, my head hurts.
I know. Mine does too. Mine does too. But again, I drawing the lines on this stuff is hard and is blurry, and I think it's confusing. But I think the lines, as blurry as they are, also help us, read some signals from the Pentagon. And so that's why, I really wanted the Space Force. A big interesting story was this Space Force programs that were initiated as part of Golden Dome now are no longer being characterized as Golden Dome. But I think there's a reasonable criticism of that and of my story. in just that, well, these lines, what do these lines mean? I think that's, again, very fair, but again, interesting. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Or it's just, a normalization, because we know Golden
Right.
Dome is and well, not a normal construct of governance, right? But that a service branch is. And so, maybe that's really what it's getting after. So that goes to, if you were to look into your crystal ball, what does this tell you about the capabilities that the Space Force has? And what is it looking for? What capabilities don't yet exist that the Space Force wants and has a budget and wants a budget to pursue?
I mean, I think the two that capability areas that, again, are just tremendous growth, where these are not
Budget growth,
necessarily
not
budget growth.
quite technology growth yet, but
Yeah. I
budget
mean, I think
growth.
the command and control, like, we'll see what that looks like. Obviously, Space Force has been doing command and control before, but not at this scale. And then moving target indication. This is a capability area where we just saw the first budget line in fiscal year 2024, ground moving. Last year, in the reconciliation package you have for air moving target, but this is just the second year, right, that we've seen this in the budget. So, a capability area that has grown massively in just a couple of years, right? There wasn't as much of a history for the Space Force or for space, right? Like, this is a mission that has historically been carried out by crewed aircraft, right? Both for ground moving and air moving. So that one, it'll be interesting to watch.
Now, I just want to wrap up this episode, and I want to bring us back to how I started it, right? I want to ask you one last thing about process. And because, as I said up at the top, we're going to have a continuing resolution to keep the government open. I don't think there's going to be, any argument exactly over that happening, because, again, we're in an election year, and, things just tend to not really get done that quickly or on time anymore. Right. So that's the not so new normal. But what gets continued is really my question, right? The Space Force 2026 budget is $26.1 billion, but it also received $5.9 billion from last year's reconciliation bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The total was $32 billion. So what happens with a continuing resolution? Will the funding level be set according to the base budget, that $26.1 billion, or the whole enchilada of $32 billion? What do you think, Sam?
It's a really good question, and I don't know, right? Like, it could be either. It could be, again, historically, we've seen typically the base budget has been the starting point for a continuing resolution. But man, that's a big difference. That's a big difference for the Space Force. I mean, again,
that's
you're
almost
talking
$6
about
billion
the amount of
difference.
uncertainty. $6 billion difference for some portion of the year. I want to make sure that I frame this right, because there's so much uncertainty for the Space Force going in to the next couple months with respect to what the timing and what the amount of this eventual budget is going to be, given that you have the space budget of 26, plus, as you noted, the $6 billion plus reconciliation. Then you have this, this massive increase in the proposed increase in the appropriations process to $59 billion. Then you also have this 12 in reconciliation. However, this is still a good news story for the Space Force, right? Like, this level of uncertainty is the reason why there's so much uncertainty and so much delta of where they could land is because the Pentagon asked for a 120% increase for the service. So I don't want to lose sight of that. But yes, I think from an execution and a planning perspective, this is going to be challenging for the Space Force.
Sam, thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Always a pleasure, Laura. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavas Ships with Chris Cavas and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.